Good evening, everybody. Just to see people coming in there from the waiting room. You're all very welcome on this pretty dark, miserable night here in Dublin. So what perfect weather conditions to talk about rewilding from the comfort of your own home or wherever you happen to be. I'll just introduce myself first, maybe, to those of you who are new to our webinar series. My name is Pádraig Fogarty. I'm the campaign officer with the Irish Wildlife Trust. The Irish Wildlife Trust is a non-governmental organization. We're a registered charity, and we've been around since the 1970s promoting nature and biodiversity and its benefits to people. So if you're interested in what we do, go on to iwt.ie, and if you'd like to support our work, please do join our organization and become a member. You'll get a copy of our magazine, and you will be supporting all of our campaign work. So tonight we're going to talk about rewilding. And this is the latest in our webinar series that we've been holding now for over 1 year. So the vast majority of the webinars that we've held so far are on our YouTube channel, and you'll find links to those from our website also. So please do go back and take a look at all of those, and you'll find a fantastic range of different themes across the marine and farming and climate change and so on. And people who know the Irish Wildlife Trust will know that we're big fans of rewilding. So that is why I'm excited to introduce our guest this evening. So Zoltan Kun is coming to us this evening from Hungary, and he describes himself as a wilderness advocate. He's worked for several years in international conservation organizations such as the WWF and Pan Parks, and he is a member of the IUCN, that's the International Union for the Conservation of Nature's World Commission on Protected Areas, and the Commission on Ecosystem Management. And he is a member of the IUCN Rewilding Working Group and Rewilding Thematic Group. So one of the reasons I asked Zoltan to come and talk to us today really was to talk a little bit about rewilding and the principles behind rewilding, and maybe banish some of the myths, or to clear up some of the misconceptions around rewilding. So Zoltan actually was one of the authors of this issues brief from the IUCN that came out last year. And it's a very useful, very short document. I'll put a link to it in our social media when this is over. But it says misunderstanding of the rewilding concept has led to applications that can harm communities and biodiversity and threaten to undermine an approach with enormous conservation potential. So we believe rewilding has enormous conservation potential, but we also acknowledge that we need to persuade people of that, and we need to assuage any fears that may arise. So I hope we will make progress on that this evening. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Zoltan. Thank you very much, Zoltan, for coming along this evening to talk to us. And in your own time, please share your screen, and we're looking forward to hearing your talk.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. Or I guess most of the audience are based in Ireland, so I shouldn't say good morning or good afternoon. But anyhow, I hope maybe we have a global audience. Yes. So basically, I'm going to talk about, I hope, rewilding from theory to practice. I try to give you an overview. I already got a bit of an introduction. As Patrick said, I'm based in Hungary, which is a country that is probably as modified landscape-wise as Ireland. We lost most of our original forest cover, and the forest cover that we have, half of it are basically plantation. But I'm going to talk about the global issue of rewilding. I'm not going to talk about Hungary. I should say thank you at the very beginning to Dr. Ian Cumberry from University of Cumbria and Dr. Steve Carver, whose presentations are basically recycled here. I will try to do my presentation in a way that it will allow having questions, and let me see if I can, yes, okay, I can go. Basically, what I'm going to talk about what is, why we need to talk about rewilding, what is the problem with the state of nature currently, what is rewilding actually, and what's the history behind rewilding. We try to do a bit of a comparison of rewilding and restoration, which both of them are legitimate concept in my view in the world of nature conservation. I will shortly introduce you to the IUCN Commission on Ecosystem Management and the rewilding principles that we were working on within the thematic working group. And at the end, I try to share 2 case studies and some personal stories maybe. I see, I don't know, I guess I don't really have to answer yet the chat box. I will deal with this at the end of my presentation. And yes, so why we need to talk about rewilding? You probably, or most of you probably heard about that we are in the middle of the 6th mass extinction, as they say. Oh yeah, I forgot to say, I'm sorry, I'm not a native English speaker. If I express myself wrongly, I apologize in advance, but yeah, that's life. But I try to be as correct English-wise as possible. The current conservation strategies are not really sufficient. What we say is that this sort of fortress conservation, when we set up certain protected areas, but they remain isolated, it doesn't really work. There is still a species extinction crisis, and several reports, including the WWF Living Planet report or the European Environmental Agency State of Nature in Europe report, shows that there is a decline in the abundance of wildlife. There is still a biodiversity crisis. For instance, the European Environmental Agency report, the State of Nature in Europe report, says that only 14% of the forest habitat types are in favor of conservation status within the Natura 2000 sites. That probably tells quite a lot also in Ireland, because you are also within the European Union, you have the Natura 2000 network as well. And I was just attending today a meeting that was organized by the European Commission on forest and Natura 2000 sites, where the Irish government representative stated that restoration of forest habitat is going to be critical in your country. So within protected areas, many species cannot really recover, either because the size is not sufficient enough, or maybe they are not actually covered. Their space is not necessarily covered by protected areas. There is also a decline in those birds that belong to open spaces, sometimes some call them farmland species, because of the increasing intensity of farming. So in very short, ecosystem continue to degrade. So we need a bit of a different approach in nature conservation. That's where rewilding actually came in, and that's one of the reasons why we need to speak about rewilding. So this is again just a graph that shows the sharp still decline of biodiversity. You can see here that 1 million species face extinction, according to the IBES, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And so, although I could show you a different figure that shows the increase of protected areas all across the globe, especially in Europe since the 70s, when the IUCN introduced the various protected area management categories, there is a sharp increase of protected areas, but the biodiversity decline still continues. So basically, again, that kind of shows that we need a new approach in nature conservation, because, as I said earlier, most biodiversity is not necessarily covered by protected areas. As this table shows you, the total wildlife in some national park, or the total national parks, and the percentage of all the wildlife. Sorry, okay, I hope it will go. Yes. And yeah, another figure that probably is kind of familiar to at least some of you, about the earth land mammals by weight, and you can see that basically humans and our pets and livestock much bigger overweight than the wild mammals or wild animals. This was actually published just 2 years ago, now 3 years ago, but I think it's a very shocking figure in a way that our impact on wildlife and our impact on the species diversity is just enormous. You can see, I mean, what is relevant for Ireland is probably sheep and cattle, huge numbers compared to the wildlife. So again, the conclusion is that what we hear very often from the conservation organization, that there is a time for a new approach to restore nature. Also, this restoration is not only about restoring nature on the side, but in a way, what I also argue very often, we need to restore our connection to nature. So we are actually working together with some of my colleagues. We are currently working on a new research project that hopefully will be funded by the European Commission, where one of the work package that we invented deals with rewilding hearts and minds. So we really need to change the human attitude towards nature as well. We need a strategy that promotes connectivity, coexistence, and the core conservation areas. And these 3 Cs will come up very soon in my presentation as part of the description of rewilding. So instead of kind of separated approach, while we still need the core areas that have fully occupied, fully functioning trophic ecosystems, like some of the wilderness places, there is also a need for connectivity between these core areas, and we need to learn coexistence as well. I mean, I can tell you, maybe because I promised to have some personal experience, in Hungary, we have the golden jackal coming back in large numbers in the past 2 decades. The golden jackal was extinct in Hungary. In the past 2 decades, it started to do its comeback. And now we are at the stage when it became an animal that, that could be hunted. In the last hunting season, 12,000 of golden jackals were killed. People are really afraid of the animal. We don't really have wolf, we don't have brown bears in Hungary, only kind of occasional visitor. But golden jackal is in large numbers. People started to afraid. 2 days ago, there was an article, which I will show you later on, about like a news in one of the major newspaper, that golden jackal was killing. And I was watching what the hell was killing. I was kind of afraid that maybe it attacked a human, but it was killing a cat, and it was killing a roe deer. That hit the news very largely. So anyway, what we are seeking for is a human-enabled, nature-led restoration, which is basically the core of rewilding. So here comes the rewilding history and the definition. Basically, within the thematic working group, well, the first thing what we have done was a bit of a literature review and to see how rewilding as a concept evolved. And what we found that it's largely linked to as a North American concept to the US. The first appearance of the word was in the Newsweek by Jennifer Foote, and then Dave Foreman around the campfire wrote a big piece about rewilding. And then in '98, Sule and Noss published the Rewilding and the Biodiversity in the Wild Earth. I believe that that's the picture that you can see as an illustration of the slide. And at the end, Foreman in 2004 published the Rewilding North America, Vision for Conservation in the 21st Century. This is where we first read about the original 3 Cs. And the 3 Cs are the core areas, connectivity between the core areas, and the role of the large carnivores in regulating ecosystems. Carnivores were actually used as a keystone species, or maybe a flagship species. That's probably a better word, because they need large areas, they need movement corridors. So that's why they were used as symbols of rewilding. However, as you will see later on, what we basically invented instead of the carnivore, which very frequently creates fear in our minds, is the coexistence. So we really need to learn how to coexist with wildlife, including carnivores. And obviously, rewilding means not only bringing back carnivores, but sometimes other type of animal. For instance, I was involved here in Hungary in the reintroduction of beaver, which is a big constructor of or engineer of nature. So at the end, one of the tasks that we have accomplished within the thematic working group was is to define what is actually rewilding based on this literature review. At the end, we found that this is basically a process. It's not an end product. Rewilding is really, and I will say this several times probably in my presentation. And sorry, I tried to have a look at my watch. Okay, 20 minutes. It's a process that rebuilds nature after a major human disturbance, and it builds natural ecosystem through natural processes. We are also found as a critical element of rewilding is to try to build a complete or near complete food web at all trophic level. And I will explain that again later on and demonstrate with an example what is this trophic level rewilding is. But basically the aim is to have self-sustaining resilient ecosystem. This is where what Patrick, the way how Patrick described me, or actually I described it to him myself, I'm a wilderness advocate. I really believe that while rewilding is a process, the end result hopefully is going to be a wilderness or an area where nature basically rules and the ecosystem, a self-sustaining and resilient ecosystem is set up. That requires obviously a paradigm shift in the relationship between humans and nature. And that's where, again, what I mentioned earlier, rewilding hearts and minds comes in. I know that rewilding creates fear, especially among local people in the rural communities, and especially among those that are use the land on a traditional way for agriculture or for forestry. They usually are at the beginning the biggest opposition or opposition party of rewilding. But I think if we consider rewilding on a landscape scale, where again the core areas with connectivity can exist together with the traditional land use, we can actually easily get the local communities as supporters of rewilding. But this requires a very early involvement of them in the project. That is one common mistake that some of the rewilding project makes, that somehow a top-down approach goes down or goes to an area. They say, okay, we will do a rewilding here, and then this comes as a sudden news for the local people. That's not really a good strategy from communication perspective. So some rewilding fallacies, what rewilding isn't. It's not about looking backwards. We're trying to recreate ecosystem, but we are not trying to recreate ecosystems from 1,000 years ago. We are sometimes the ecosystem that we create might become a novel ecosystem that is not there. Rewilding is not possible everywhere. So it's not that we would like to rewild all single landscape, but because that would be basically stupid. We still need to have food. We need to have important communities like timber. It's also not anti-farming. And I'd like to refer back here to that we need food. And I also said earlier that if we work on a landscape level, I think we are able to get the farmers as supporters for rewilding, because rewilding can help actually also to decrease the natural disturbances. For instance, rewilding areas can help to protect soil. It can help protect areas against flash flood. It's also not anti-people. We really would like to work with human, with the land use or landowners as well. And another point here that I really would like to raise, that rewilding should also come with a bit of a change in the way how we think about economy. Because sometimes a landowner, hopefully in the future, will be paid to actually do nothing, to actually do, how to call it, store, for instance, carbon in the landscape, or let nature to grow itself, because he's land at a critical location that can protect, again, a complete watershed, or can protect a settlement from, for instance, flash floods. So it's not necessarily about bringing back carnivores, wolves or bear, but species reintroduction can be an important part. And again, I really sincerely believe that bringing back carnivores is still possible, even in a landscape like Hungary, where we basically forgot how to live together with these carnivores. And I guess that applies to islands like Ireland as well, that some of the carnivores might be able to come back at a later stage. So sorry for the Chinese letters. That's because, again, this is a recycled slide which was used in a presentation in China. But basically, this slide demonstrates the rewilding as a process and the continuum of human modification. So as you could see on the top, we have urban cities. There is an intensive land use, an agri-landscape, semi-natural landscape, cultural wildland or wilderness estate, and wilderness. These are all part of the whole continuum of wilderness. Here we demonstrated what is the degree of naturalness and remoteness, potentially, for instance, from roads or other human infrastructure. And as you can see on the top, at the top end, there is rewilding, free sea rewilding, but rewilding actually starts slightly earlier, when we have smaller scale nature development already, starting possibly with rehabilitation and then ecological restoration, that at the end turns into rewilding, ending up with secondary wilderness. So as rewilding as a nature-led, human-enabled, and that's one of the big difference between restoration, which is human-led, nature-enabled. That's the kind of basic difference between the two concepts. So I already mentioned several times that the all rewilding might be considered as restoration, but actually not all restoration is rewilding. And there is a whole wideness concept that we need to move our mind from the control to decontrol nature and let nature to work on its own. I see now in the chat box quite a lot of comment and Q&A as well, but as I said, I will try to deal with these at the end of my presentation. I hope that's okay. So going back to the history, last year IUCN had its World Conservation Congress in Marseille, where I met with Patrick as well as representative of the Irish Wildlife Trust. During that Congress, IUCN members approved the rewilding resolution, which actually led that apart from or beyond our thematic working group, IUCN set up a cross-commission rewilding working group as well, which I'm also a member of. But today I'm talking on behalf of the thematic working group. This resolution was approved. Here in the corner, you can see the voting. Huge majority voted yes for this resolution from both the government sector and from the civil society sector as well. So I'm now trying to talk about a little bit about rewilding versus ecological restoration. There is obviously still an ongoing discussion. That's why the working group was set up, the IUCN working group was set up as a cross-commission working group to try to resolve the ongoing discussion that still goes on within the conservation sector. But basically, what we really would like to do is avoid creating islands. Earlier, I mentioned rewilding as a nature-led, human-enabled concept, while restoration is a human-led, nature-enabled concept. And again, in the center of rewilding, there is this free sea, the core, connectivity, and coexistence, with some focus on animals as keystone species. You can see, and I'm not going to read up the principles because basically I can make my presentation available through Patrick to all the audience and also people who are not able to watch today us. So the presentation will be available and you will be able to read all the principles. But basically the Society for Ecological Restoration has set up already the principles of ecological restoration from principle 2, for instance, which is an informed native reference ecosystem, to describing restoration as a part of a continuum of restorative activities. So there are these 8 principles which we also used in order to set up the rewilding principles. I already mentioned, I just tried to show a few of the literatures that we used during the process of developing the rewilding guiding principles. I already mentioned that all rewilding could be considered as restoration, but not all restoration is rewilding. This is just a bit of a repetition of one of the earlier slides. And basically with ecological restoration, we are trying to return to an ecosystem back to the way it was. Reintroduction is returning species back to where it used to live, and rewilding is returning a managed area back to wild. So where basically ecosystem is resilient, and then there is a natural process that manages the land. So I still have about 30 minutes for 2 subjects. One of them is the Commission of Ecosystem Management Rewilding Thematic Working Group, which I'm a member of, and Pedrik showed this issue brief that we developed for IUCN. The initial aim of the initially it was called as a task force. It was set up in 2017. And with the aim of consulting and uniting scientists, academics, various advocates and practitioners. We also involved recreation experts to create a common basis for the development and understanding of rewilding. Again, because especially in Europe, rewilding had started to have a bit of a different meaning than in North America. Rewilding got to be used as a term also in Australia, then also in other continents. In Europe, sometimes rewilding was used more as a marketing or communication term. And as we all have, or most of the Europeans have, a bit of a sentiment to the open managed landscape, rewilding was often used to actually help the abundant landscape to remain open and trying to avoid forest comeback. That kind of, I would call it as a challenge, should be solved, and we wanted to have a kind of common understanding how rewilding could be seen also in Europe. So we surveyed rewilding pioneers. We have done a literature review that you have seen, or I explained a little bit, and I showed some of the literatures that we looked at. The survey was done basically throughout all the globe. We also had workshops in various continents. At the end, we developed guiding principles, and then we developed this rewilding continuum model that was part of my presentation. The draft rewilding guiding principles, which is available on the internet, I think, as an open source science publication, defines, again, or starts with the description of what rewilding is, function, and I highlighted a few elements from the definition: functioning native ecosystems, trophic level, nature-led, self-sustaining, and dynamic ecosystems that are not static, rebuilding of native ecosystem, complete food web. I mean, these are the keywords that are in the definition of rewilding. And then we basically came up with 10 rewilding principles. The first, as I said, this is available online. So if you type in rewilding guiding principles, and I will show later, and you can even download it from the IUCN website, you can study these guiding principles. The first is about utilizing wildlife to restore trophic interaction, includes the reintroduction of and enforcement of apex predators and keystone species. Rewilding should employ landscape scale planning, as I said already, core areas, connectivity, coexistence, and that also means that within the landscape we are able to still remain the traditional land use as well. Rewilding requires local engagement. I mentioned already that without getting the local support and starting rewilding as a top-down approach, it wouldn't work. I have already seen projects failing because funding was provided from the top to do something locally, but the locals refused to actually use this funding. Rewilding focuses on the recovery of ecological process in interactions, and it's based on a reference ecosystems, but obviously, as I said earlier, it might end up with some novel type of ecosystem locally that was not there earlier. Therefore, rewilding recognizes that ecosystems are dynamic and could change constantly due to climatic or other environmental conditions. I'm soon at the end of the 10 principles. Rewilding should anticipate the impact of climate change, and we have to take this into account when planning. Rewilding could be part or could be one element of nature-based solutions, again, among other elements like traditional conservation activity or restoration itself. Rewilding is informed by science, so science should be considered as well as the indigenous and local knowledge. So again, here we would like to highlight the importance of the involvement of local people and local information. That is also part of that research project which I mentioned earlier, that will be hopefully funded by the European Commission. Rewilding recognizes the intrinsic value of species. So it's not only that everything could be valued based on the current economic valuation. It's a very important part actually to consider the practical application of payment for ecosystem services. That is very, very critical, I think, for rewilding and for the future of successful nature conservation. Rewilding is adaptive. It includes monitoring and then obviously provides feedback to the process. So even if we have a really good and careful planning, we might need to change our project due to the results that we see. And rewilding provides an opportunity for paradigm shift. This is what I said. We talked about coexistence, but I'd really like to highlight rewilding the hearts and minds of people. These are really, really critical. And yeah, I just put together or next to each other the 8 principles of ecosystem restoration and or ecological restoration, and I put there the rewilding principles. As I said, I'm not going to read it up, small letters anyway, but you will be able to see this in the PDF that I will provide to you after the presentation. And again, from ego to eco, and a kind of summary of what I have already said earlier, the 3 C's, the core, connectivity, coexistence, these are really, really critical for this paradigm shift. This is where you are able to download the principles of rewilding from the IUCN website. Our work, there is a special page for rewilding, and then under downloads, you are able to see all these principles. The examples. And that's the last part of my presentation. I hope I will be able to finish it in 6 minutes now. Why and what is needed actually? So in order to support this IUCN issue brief that you already saw at the beginning of the webinar, we also wanted to collect a few case studies to demonstrate what are these principles, what are the rewilding principles, what are the best practices, and what could be the lessons learned or the mistakes to be avoided. We looked at the Society for Ecological Restoration project database. That was one of the sources of information. We developed a case study template, which has basically 5 parts: why rewilding was needed at a local area, who initiated it, what rewilding action was taken, what are the results, lessons learned, and sources of information. The list is still not available on the IUCN website because we are still working on it. But here I just wanted to again show you or demonstrate how we see the core connectivity, the linkage between the core and the compatible land use together with the coexistence. And I'd like to highlight again, agriculture, industrial settlements, these could still be on a landscape level fit into rewilding, leading to an ecological civilization. So one of the examples that I use is from basically Yellowstone, where this trophic cascade was studied through keystone species. And after first 15 years after wolf introduction, you could see the problem was really the huge number of grazing animal. Then you could see the devastated grazing field, and then there was the introduction, and basically the wolf were regulating the the grazing population or herbivore population. So too many of these resulted in overbrowsing and landscape erosion until the wolves were introduced. And then here you can see how the species number changed. Beaver came back, willow, the coverage changed, bison came back, aspen started to grow in the area through introducing one single species. So again, the trophic cascade effect is important because the species population are regulated. Some people, at least in Hungary, say that, oh, hunters can actually play the role of the large carnivores. I must say they cannot. We, as hunters, we are not there at the, in the landscape 24 hours for 7 days. So why wolf is there? So the wolf could really better regulate the landscape than hunters. And yeah, at the end, you know, through one keystone species, the diversity of species created stability, persistence, and resilience. And the resilience is really important because self-sustaining ecosystems are much more resilient also against climate change impact. So here, the biodiversity crisis and the climate change crisis link together. So another example is from Poland, that is closer, it's within the European Union, where basically rewilding was initiated because there was a traditional forest land use in the landscape. The local economy changed. There was a acknowledgement of the natural processes much more, and wildness and naturalness was needed in the landscape. So basically, within the national park, a passive rewilding, non-intervention management started. That obviously applied not to all of the habitat types, but helped the nature conservation also to evolve and to see what are the habitat types that fit into this rewilding process. So as you can see, it started with a relatively small core area. I tried to circle around, this was the picture in 1998 of the zonation of the park. And then that was 2001, 2011, and then the projected 2014. Basically, the idea was to enlarge the non-intervention zone inside the national park through a bit of a strategic planning. This 2001 picture was a plan, and then 2011 was a reality, and they managed to actually enlarge the park, at least the non-intervention management of the park, from roughly 1,400 hectares up to over 4,000 hectares, which is left now free of human intervention. And as you can see, the result was actually a significant improvement of the structure of the forest. Also conserved bogs, which might be also relevant to island or your freshwater habitat, because again, rewilding is not about forest. Yeah, rewilding could be applied to any habitat type, freshwater habitats as well. Faunistic values increased. The impression of naturalness and wildness gradually became a key factor for the park visitor, and so it helped to actually build an economy, to diversify the economy and consider nature-based tourism also as part of the local economy. So there are some lessons learned as well, which from that I'd like to highlight the second point again, that the social aspect of increasing the non-intervention management must be considered. So here, in this Polish case, the local foresters had to be convinced that they have to be part of this process as well. I already mentioned to you the example of beaver in Hungary. This photograph is I took this photo about 4 weeks ago. We introduced the beaver in 2 different locations first, and then 3, 4, but then the beaver gradually went out to basically every suitable habitat now, which proves that basically the reason why beaver was extinct in Hungary was due to hunting and not necessarily due to the lack of or the human modification of the landscape. And then this is the golden jackal, as you can see here. I mean, this is a Hungarian news that golden jackal was killing close to Peresztek, which is a settlement. And I was really, really afraid that maybe golden jackals killed a human or maybe a child or kid, but it's actually about a cat, and the roe deer were killed by the golden jackal, which I find it kind of ridiculous to make it in the news so strongly. So thank you very much. And I mean, I have some final note here, but
yeah, take your time, Zoltan. If you want to say something else, go ahead.
But yeah, I'd also like to look at later on the Q&A. The final note is the 2 that I highlighted with green. In a way, it's a bit of a moral argument that humans have a responsibility to other species as well, and also to restore the self-regulating, self-sustaining ecological community, to move from our ecocentric world to a little bit more a biocentric world. So largely behind rewilding, there is a moral argument that we need. But obviously, I understand that that would require also change, even in the economy. And I mentioned already payment for ecosystem services. It might be only a dream, my dream, but I really hope that at a certain point, maybe some landowners will be paid because they managed to revive their land. And then, for instance, they managed in Ireland to set up turf again, and not burning turf for energy, but trying to recreate, to store carbon in the land. And then there are various evidences why this is needed. Obviously, this is not an argument only of the, sorry for the phrase, middle-class riffraff, which probably I'm also part of myself as living in a relatively large city. But actually, I think during the COVID era, we could see quite often that going out to nature helped to restore the mental and physical well-being for a lot of people. So actually, we also need nature. And I think that's where what COVID showed us in the past 2 years. Thanks very much. I think I stopped sharing my screen, and I hope I was clear. I tried to have a look at the Q&A.
Well, I tell you what, Zoltan, I have a question for you. And just while you're catching your breath, I'm going to ask people to make sure that if you have a question for Zoltan, put it in the Q&A rather than the chat. I normally say that at the beginning, but I forgot this time. There's already a few questions in there, but if you did put something in the chat, maybe just cut and paste it into the Q&A. And we'll come to some of your questions in a minute. I suppose one of the aims I had for holding this webinar was because I hear an awful lot that rewilding is very flaky, that it doesn't have science behind it, that it's really anything for everybody. And I think what Zoltan has demonstrated to us is that actually there's an awful lot of science behind it, and an awful lot of effort has gone into framing policy around it. So it does, I think, have quite firm foundations. Now, one of the questions maybe I have for you, Zoltan, because possibly the 2 most common arguments I hear, number one, from other ecologists, is that rewilding is about doing nothing, and that you can't just do nothing. You can't just walk away from a piece of land that you might not get good conservation outcomes by simply doing nothing. So you might comment on that. And then the other related argument is that when we talk about rewilding, particularly with rural communities, they associate it very quickly with land abandonment. And it becomes a very negative association then with that you want to drive people off the land, and you just want to replace people with wolves, and you get this very negative reaction very quickly. So could you comment maybe on those two things, please?
Okay, I'm sorry, I was muted. So the first, I think there is science, and rewilding is one of the pictures in my presentation. What I showed is what I wanted to demonstrate, that rewilding is really a process that might start with ecological restoration. In a way, let me give you maybe an example of the Nephin from Ireland. Yeah, I have been visiting Ireland like 3 or 4 times, and I mean, obviously I like Guinness, I like Irish music, I like whiskey and whatever. But what I also found really interesting is the White Nephin project, where I think the first thing you should do is an active rewilding. So actually that could even create more jobs locally, like changing the plantation forest back to a natural forest in the Ballycroy area, and then removing the rhododendron, for instance, from large part of the land. That would require significant human intervention at the very beginning, before letting nature to come back. So there is always how to call it, like a process of rewilding. It's not necessarily about letting nature do. At the point, you reach that point where you let nature to do its job, but maybe you need a bit of a guidance at the very beginning. Yeah, removing a road, for instance, or removing human infrastructure, that could be also part of the start of rewilding. A second question is the fear. Is that the fear that you are trying to say of species? Yes, I know it comes, and this is what I wanted to say, and I hope it came through clearly, that when you start the field work, the kind of ecological rewilding, you need to do parallel the human rewilding of the society. I have seen pictures, and I think it was you who shared it, right, on Twitter, where there were kids demonstrating in Ireland that they don't want the sheep to be removed from one of the mountains. And I understand that the local communities' kids are kind of mobilized by their parents to do this kind of demonstration, but if we explain to them how the landscape would look like, and then there is still sheep grazing maybe in the future, but in different location, maybe in a smaller scale, maybe not causing that much of an overgrazing, I think they could be turned into supporters, and the role of the various animals, including carnivores in the ecosystem, has to be explained to people. In Ireland, this is going to be, I think, much more complex than in the continental Europe, because for you to really bring back a lot of species require an active effort. Yeah. In Hungary, sooner or later, wolf will come back. I'm 100% sure we already have wolf in Hungary, because they move large distances. But for you, you have time actually in Ireland to prepare the society to this bit of a change. Is this a good answer to your question?
Yes, yeah, absolutely, okay. Yeah. And I suppose having time to talk about it, I suppose that there's pluses and minuses to it. Where most of us are just jealous of countries that will have wolves wandering over the borders, but
also, I mean, for Ireland, you have various marine habitat types, and I'm not a marine expert, but I think rewilding, and within the rewilding working group that we have now with the IUCN, there is a marine expert. Rewilding can happen also in marine areas, and I think that's maybe something where Ireland can start, because maybe there is less conflict, or I don't know, but in order to promote rewilding, and sorry to use this again as a bit of a marketing term, but indeed rewilding sometimes is only used as communication or marketing term, and what we need to do is avoiding using this simply as a marketing term. It's not about rebranding. Rewilding is not about rebranding farming, for instance, so not about rebranding ecosystem restoration. It's a different process. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And maybe if you started with a marine area where the conflict is maybe less, then the Irish society might be better prepared for terrestrial rewilding as well.
Very good, very good. I'm going to have 10 minutes left, so I'm going to just go through some of the questions we have in the Q&A here. And Natasha is asking an interesting question, I think. And she says, in Europe, you can't go very far without encountering a road. How can you have wildlife coexisting with our transport infrastructure?
Yeah, this is a very difficult question. I mean, one of the things that I have observed, for instance, here in Hungary is that, yeah, we have more and more dense roads, but one element, we are trying to make them, in some cases at least, more wildlife friendly by building wildlife crossing over the roads. That could be one. IUCN also has a special group that deals with this kind of conflicts between wildlife and road infrastructure. I would also argue that actually we need to stop building roads. Yeah, there is a roadless area initiative that I also really like. I'm not involved in it, but I think it's a brilliant initiative to try to protect those land that are still roadless in Europe. And fantastic news just came, I think this week, actually last week. Greece has designated 3 larger landscape area where there is no road, that they remain roadless in the future because they recognized exactly this problem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and some places are showing that there are these technical solutions like building wildlife corridors and bridges, as you've tunnels and things like that, as you've mentioned. Kyle has asked a question that has been on my mind as well, and he asks, what is your favorite rewilding success story? And maybe just as a second part to that question, Zoltan, is that is rewilding a global phenomenon, or is it just something that has been happening in Europe and North America? But where would stand out for you as some of the best examples?
No, it's a global phenomenon. And I mean, I've seen projects in Australia, in Africa, Latin America, and actually one of my favorite, and I see here someone saying I should slow down. Yeah, I try to be slower, sorry. One of my favorite projects is actually in Latin America, in Chile, where they have in Argentina, where private investor Tompkins, I think, bought some big pieces of land from his fortune, and then he turned them into protected areas and started to do rewilding by bringing back also species. I mean, I just read stories about this. So if this resulted some local conflict with local communities, I'm not aware of it. But from my, let's say, faraway conservation perspective, these were really, really brilliant projects. In the recent National Geographic, there was an article about Serengeti and rewilding Serengeti, actually, which might sound strange because most people would associate it with wild or wilderness. But actually bringing back the wildebeest was a big, big issue in the Serengeti to provide them more space for grazing, that resulted decrease of other animals and increase of the carnivores. So that's also a success story. If I may say, I mean, as I said, I was involved in the beaver introduction, and I hope in Hungary, and I hope that this beaver introduction will lead to significant rewilding of some of our protected areas as well. Certainly, the introduction of beaver is a success from conservation perspective, and it's a big trouble for some of the forest owners and some of the water management authorities. But that again shows that we might have needed a little bit more careful planning and better social preparation.
And how did that project go, or how is it going in Hungary? Were beavers welcomed?
Yeah, they were, but beavers are cute animal. I mean, most people don't know them that they are rodent. So, and we also didn't know that it's going to be. Honestly, when I started it, I used to work at WWF at that time. I didn't think it's going to be so successful. We thought that the reason why beaver got extinct in the 19th century, the last one was shot only 20 kilometers away from where I live in 1867, we said that the reason why it went extinct is probably because we turned most of our floodplain and wetland area into agriculture area and hunting. I must say we were wrong. It was only hunting. Yeah, and nowadays people are not interested to eat beaver. In the past, if I'm correct, the Roman Catholic Church considered beaver as a fish, so they could be eaten even in this 40 days period. So probably that resulted that they were killed also for the fur and other reasons. But now, as they are not hunted, no one is really interested in hunting. They are spread all across the country.
Yeah, a real success story in many countries now. Finbar is asking a slightly different question now. He's asking, will the EU help fund rewilding projects? And I suppose that related to that, I mean, is the EU, we have the biodiversity strategy and so on, and 30 by 30 and all these things. Is rewilding a part of that?
Yes, although I think rewilding is not mentioned in the EU biodiversity strategy. But some of you might know that the EU has set up a target to launch a nature restoration law, a binding law. So, and that will be a binding law to every member state. That is of course restoration, but as I said, rewilding could be part of restoration. And yes, the EU is funding some rewilding project through the LIFE funding. I think I know at least two of them. Now, within the Horizon Europe, they allocated 15 million euro for two research projects that will look into how rewilding can bring climate and biodiversity benefits. And honestly, if for landowners, I think there will be even more opportunity through the through the carbon farming. It could go also in a very wrong direction, obviously, this carbon farming, because if you just consider planting monoculture trees, that could go absolutely wrong. But if we think of reestablishing natural forest, secondary natural forest, it can go quite in a good direction through EU support. There are plenty of funding available, I think, and even after this Recovery and Resilience Fund of the EU, after the COVID, part of it could be used for climate and biodiversity purposes. If I remember correctly, 37% of the total fund of the RRF could be used for climate and biodiversity. Let's use this as much as possible for rewilding.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the money is out there, but as you say, there is sometimes a lot of fear as to how that money is spent, and you know, when the lobbyists get their hands on it. I have a slightly related question here, and it's probably our last question of the evening, and it's from Sive. And hi, Sive. And Sive is asking you, what do you think of the various land use and forestry projects that are being developed for carbon offsetting? Is there any sort of rewilding that could be compatible with those kinds of projects, and is it ethical?
Ooh, this is a difficult question, because I'm not a big fan of this carbon offsetting stuff, honestly, because sometimes it leads to land grabbing, and sometimes it leads only, like, as I said, planting monocultures. And honestly, in the past decade, I was arguing that we would need a new definition of forest. And we have to differentiate between trees and forest, or tree monoculture or tree farm is nothing else than, I don't know, a cropland. Yeah. If you talk about forest, that's a different story. So I think when it comes to the carbon offset, the first thing I would do, don't cut down any primary forest any longer. That should be the starting point. Try to protect or preserve the carbon that is already in the land storage through the forest. Yeah. And then through the so-called proforestation, you can reestablish secondary forest as quasi-virgin or old-growth forest. That would be a better way. But you know, I'm not a big fan of carbon offsetting. You know, companies that do dirty business, and then they say, okay, but I offset my carbon emissions somewhere else. I don't know. I mean, I always visualize it in a way that I do something really bad at my home, but then I give, I don't know, I don't know how many euro to someone in Kenya to plant a tree. It wouldn't have. Imagine that tree that I was funding would grow in my house. Then I would be a bit of an upset. So I'm not a big fan of this carbon offsetting stuff. Sorry if this is not a complete answer, but I try to be short.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of concern about carbon offsetting and what it might mean and how it might be used. And of course, we want nature restored, not because it's offsetting carbon, but because we want nature to be restored. So look, Zoltan, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add before we wrap up. I think there's loads of questions there, but and we still have over 300 people on the webinar. So, you know, it's a wonderful testament to the interest in what you have, what you're saying. Is there anything else you want to add before we go?
Well, it's a question then to you. I mean, I hate leaving a webinar without answering questions, and there are so many questions. I didn't even look at the chat because over 100 comment. Is it kind of possible that you save them? And I don't know. I will try to do my best to maybe answer it in writing through your website, or I don't know, maybe in a newsletter that you provide.
Yeah, sure.
I don't say that I will do it really quickly, because currently we are working on a proposal that has to be submitted within 48 hours. But hopefully next week I should be able to answer some of the questions at least.
Well, that's very good of you, Zoltan. We already appreciate so much you giving us your time to talk about that, and I think it was a fascinating presentation, and we wish you very well in your work going forward. And so, just to everybody else at home, I want to thank you all for joining us. The webinar will be online. We'll post it to our YouTube account later in the week, and please share it with your friends. We can look back and read the slides that Zoltan put up. And yeah, so don't forget to join the Irish Wildlife Trust. Make sure you follow us on social media. An awful lot happening these days. Our next webinar will be early in March, and we're going to be looking at peatlands and a very exciting new project in Ireland, looking at restoring blanket bogs in Ireland, which I think will be very interesting. More and on. So just thank you again, Zoltan, and good night, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks.